Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate everyone taking their time out of their day to join us for one of our webinars. Uh, Today is a webinar that I'm personally really excited about. I've been in the geothermal space for 20 years, and my name's Tim Weber, co-founder of Diverso Energy. And when I started in the space 20 years ago, ironically, we're kind of going full circle here. It was in low-rise single-family homes, but it was primarily retrofitting, custom homes, and retrofitting from oil and propane or electric resistance. Very rarely was it natural gas. And at that time, the idea of rolling geothermal out into the production home market and displacing natural gas is something that I thought would probably never happen in my lifetime. It just seemed like too big of a gap. It's an industry that Enbridge and other gas utilities had a stranglehold on. And just the nature of production home building made the introduction of a complex technology like geothermal just way too daunting, too complex, too cost prohibitive. So very excited today to talk about how Mattamy has sort of cracked this code and how they're actually building zero blue flame, full geothermal, no gas communities and doing it both technically and financially successfully. So today we brought Pawan Subherwal, who's one of the kind of leads in this initiative for Mattamy. Pawan is the Senior Manager of Renewables for Mattamy Asset Management. Um, Pawan is one of the drivers behind Fernsby, which is Mattamy's geothermal energy as a service company. It started approximately 5 years ago. His primary focus is, sustainability and more specifically the decarbonization of buildings, both low rise and mid and high rise. And as much as Mattamy is doing both, probably more mid to high than low, we really want to talk about the low rise business. High rise has been around for a while. We've been doing this for 10 years. And I think this is exciting for me. I feel like I'm going back 10 years ago when we created something new in the high rise space between technology advancement, the business model. It was pretty exciting. That is a market that's fairly well evolved, fairly stable at this point. And now we're looking at low rise as sort of the next frontier for geothermal. So, Pawan, pleasure to have you today.
Thanks, Tim.
So, I guess my question for you, what motivated Mattamy to get into this space? Because, Mattamy's a merchant builder, you're a production builder, you have a template, a copy, paste, repeat. So it's interesting to me that to see Mattamy as a leader in, not only sustainability, but something as significant as geothermal.
Yeah, no, great question, Tim. So I think it's a combination of a couple of things. So I guess 5 years ago, it started through a clear top-down and strategic mandate to look at businesses that kind of hit three key themes, right? One is innovation, the other was technology, and then the third was sustainability, the most important one. Um, Geothermal energy as a service obviously hit all those three key themes. So over the past 5 years, we've done, like you said, mid-rise, high-rise, and low-rise on geothermal. Um, but as call it a year ago, we kind of performed a SWOT analysis on the geothermal utility business, right? Looking at the strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. And our strengths are, call it, the upfront design optimization, integrating it into the home building value chain. But our weaknesses kind of lie in operating of the assets, right? And the customer relationship management piece. Like we're not set up, as a utility business, right? We're set up as, optimize the upfront, build a home, sell said home, right? So obviously this was kind of a learning process, right? And an opportunity that came out of this was, you know, partnering with someone like Diverso Energy to, you know, take on that operating of assets, the customer relationship management piece, which is your guys' bread and butter and expertise in managing a utility. So, been on a journey over the past, call it 4.5, 5 years. And this joint venture, I think, is what positions us to be set up for success and offer our home buyers and customers a total sustainability package, right? So we're taking the best of both worlds as we offer geothermal to our homeowners.
Yeah, so it's interesting. You guys rolled this out, what was it, 5, 6 years ago?
5 years ago, yeah.
Years ago. Learning curve, no doubt. And I say that because I've been there, been part of that learning curve. Um, looking back over the last 5 years, what would you say were the greatest challenges? Kind of reflecting, at the wins and losses, the strikes and gutters. What do you see? What were the most significant learning curve moments for you?
Yeah, like a lot of lessons learned, right? Like this is not an easy endeavor to take on yourself, right? I think it requires requires a dedicated team specifically focused on geothermal, right? I think a couple of the lessons learned, I'll just start firing them off. An organization that builds, to your point, low-rise homes, mid-rise, high-rise in their specific processes, templates, blah, blah, blah. It's hard to integrate a new technology into it, right? So change management, biggest lesson learned, right? Yeah, you have to look at the whole home building value chain, and you got to figure out what the implications are across each major vertical, right? So that's all the way from land acquisition to call it warranty, right? Um, you think you have this technology, it'll just integrate into the beast that is home building. That's not the case, right? And we were still learning, different pain points that we're experiencing across that home building value chain. So it continues to be a learning process, but I'll say change management, getting ahead of it, understanding the motivations and understanding the incentives for each of those verticals, and then integrating this technology into it. Second one was, making the financials work. This had to be a business at the end of the day, right? We'd all love to do, sustainability on someone else's dime. Can't happen in a organization that's a for-profit organization, right? So it's really difficult in the beginning for us to understand the supplier base, look at, ways combining the different suppliers to deliver the geothermal infrastructure, right? And for the first project or two projects, it was hard to hit our hurdle rates, right? Because A, we didn't understand the market, and B, geothermal is still nascent, right? So facing those challenges, I think we've done a lot of great work to, ride that hockey stick curve to where we're at now. And the third one was, how do we sell this to our homeowners, right? 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, low-rise geothermal, forget about it, right? Everyone's putting in ACs and furnaces, and that was the go-to market, call it from an HVAC perspective. And homeowners, frankly, didn't care about HVAC. And when we switched to geothermal, that's when they started, some homeowners started asking questions. And I'm not saying that homeowners generally care about HVAC, but when you change what you've typically been doing, you start drawing eyes to it, right? So we had to go back to the drawing board of how do we sell geothermal? Do we have it figured out? No, I don't think so. But we're still working at it, right? So I think those were kind of the key three, you know, biggest lessons learned. I would say that we kind of faced over the 5 years.
Yeah, it's interesting for me. For those who don't know, Diverso Energy and Mattamy, we recently just we released a press release on a joint venture. We've been working on this for a year, just or so. Yeah, about a year. And what's interesting for me, I've been pushing geothermal for a long time, and we've been offering our energy service utility model for the last 10 years, working throughout the GTA with lots of developers, condos, rentals. And it's selling something that's new that a lot of developers didn't necessarily want is really hard, and it kind of forces you to look under every rock for every value proposition you can find, every angle. And what's been interesting for me, do you think there's a correlation? You guys are now looking at selling geothermal at a time. It's probably been a while that Mattamy's had to really work hard to sell homes, right? Like selling homes for the last decade has not been difficult. Now, for obvious reasons, it is. So do you see geothermal as an opportunity to enhance the sale? Because the first thing I noticed when I walked into a Mattamy home with geothermal is homes now are the home prices have gone up, property sizes have gone down, right? So from a land perspective, you're getting a lot less for your money now than you did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And furnace venting, water heater venting, and air conditioners take up really valuable real estate. And not only do they take up space, the first thing I noticed in a Mattamy home was you have a deck that's the entire width of the back of the house, and it's not encumbered by mechanical equipment and there's no noise. So do you find that, that's something that you guys are really leveraging, that it's not just about sustainability, which is not necessarily an easy sell to everyone, but do you feel like the real estate and the um just the overall quality of living that comes with as a byproduct with geothermal, is that a selling feature you guys are leveraging?
So I think Tim, great point, right? I think that hypothesis remains to be tested. I'd love to say that, we put these benefits in the pamphlet, the sales agents on the floor communicated said benefits, and this was one of the driving decisions of why someone bought the home. I'd love to say that, right? I'd love to say that right now. But I think that hypothesis needs to be tested, and I think we need to have enough data points to say, hey, look, statistically speaking, this is a significant call it uh like the hypothesis is proven, right? Like, and we have significant data points to prove that. Will we be leveraging that for future sales launches? Absolutely, right? And I think this kind of organically came out of some of the conversations where you and I were having, and I was having with our SVP of operations. Yeah, I think at the next sales launch we'll communicate this and see whether it plays a factor. And then the other thing I'll also say is that I think to your point, land's expensive. We want to, give consumers the most amount of livable space, and that means the homes are going to get call it the ratio of call it detached homes to attached homes, call it townhouses. We're going to see more townhouses in the future, right? So the outdoor condenser units, you can imagine in a community on the hottest day of the summer, that's a very loud community. It gets very loud, right? Almost uncomfortable for some people. Some people can't sleep in those situations. So I think geothermal plays actually more and more of a potentially important role when you're designing these types of communities that from a livability standpoint, in the hottest day of the summer, it's pitch quiet, right? You can sit on your patio, you can enjoy that extra incremental space that you've kind of earned with choosing geothermal, and you're offering this service, sorry, this experience to homeowners that typically would not have existed had you had a traditional AC or furnace. But again, hypothesis to be proven, and I'd love to say that this happens today.
Yeah, it's interesting for me having with this joint venture now, it's what's unique for us is I feel like for the first time, the low rise community, it's something we can tackle where we have a willing participant on the other side.
For
And
sure.
a little more into this later on why did we never get into this? But I think my question for you over the last 5 years, you mentioned kind of that learning curve. Um, I think nowadays when people talk about low-rise communities, the first word that always comes up is district energy. And there seems to be like it's a default term. It's a nice soundbite that, you know, um, economies of scale. And if you want to roll geothermal out into a low-rise community, they have to be connected. It's district. I'm curious, you guys have been there, you've tried different technologies, and what's your perspective on the right technology to make this work for everything you talked about earlier? It needs to be profitable, it needs to be scalable, it needs to be simple, and it also needs to have the least amount of impact on the rest of Mattamy Homes, which is
For
built,
sure.
right? There's still the constructability of these homes.
For sure.
Take people through the last 5 years on your low rise.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when I kind of started, like let's say 5 years ago, and we were creating the genesis of Fernsby, the I like the caveat. Look, there's a time and place for district, but our journey, I think, as we went through it on the low rise front, we had some lessons learned, and we came to our solution. It may not be for everyone, but I'll just caveat with that before we kind of get into the journey, right? I'm not saying district doesn't make sense, but I'm saying it depends on certain contexts, right? So Yeah, so when we initially looked at full low-rise district energy systems, right? And that's the one up in one of our developments in Markham. Um, that had its challenges, right? That had challenges because you were putting geothermal infrastructure in the public right of ways. That requires, an agreement between the city and the geothermal provider, which again is not. It was the first time they were doing it, so you're starting from scratch, right? And hopefully that can be leveraged for future municipalities. But again, it's an agreement that needs to be hammered out from scratch, right? Because each municipality has its own right of way implications. Um, you just mentioned, Tim, that a full district energy system has ripple impacts across the home building value chain, right? Um, like the commissioning of a full district system does get in the way of closing subsequent houses, right? So we wanted to come to a solution that you didn't want adjacent homes to get in the way of closing just because you weren't able to commission the HVAC system of your first house, um, and thereby delaying closings, right? So again, that led us to kind of have a eureka moment of like, oh wait, like this is an implication that can exist with district energy systems. Um, and, you know, from an owning and operating perspective, district energy system, just more infrastructure. It's just more O&M. And, we did some modeling to just see that, from a pure profitability perspective, the risk reward just didn't make sense. Um, and the other piece is that commissioning such a big system is just everything just has to go perfect. And there's a potential for a ripple implications post occupancy if certain sections didn't get completely flushed or the infrastructure wasn't commissioned properly, right? So just the risk reward profile, the implications on the constructability, the implications on potentially closing homes throughout the entire community. We tried it, didn't make sense for the organization, right? Then the next stage we looked at is, okay, let's look at micro district systems, right? So kind of one street block at a time to still take advantages of the low diversity that exists in the district, but localize it to blocks. Again, similar issues as before. Like the risk didn't necessarily go away just because you segmented the district system into micro district systems. And frankly, what we also noticed in district energy systems in low-rise communities is that everyone is heating and cooling at the same time. So the load diversity that you think exists does not necessarily exist. The one thing I'll give district is sure there's a reliability aspect to it that hey, in the event something goes down, you have call it a greater reliability, but that still didn't I guess surpass the other downsides that existed with low-rise district. And then what we ultimately landed on, which in my eyes, I love these, keep it stupid, simple solutions, was individual boreholes per home, right? Address all of the pain points that we faced with micro district and district energy systems with hitting our profitability hurdle rates, minimizing any impact to the home building constructability processes, and then not implicating closings and being able to provide just that on time, staying on schedule implications that would have existed with micro district and district systems.
So what's interesting to me, and I get into these conversations all the time, often the larger, more complex technologies like a district is really it's pushed by sustainability advocates. So tell me, if you look at the first community you did and versus now, what about from a carbon reduction or decarbonization? Because was the district 100% zero
Yeah,
gas? So it's interesting now as you guys are,
good point.
I love your tagline, zero blue flame communities like that. I'm not sure how you get any lower carbon than eliminating gas completely.
Yeah. So that community I was talking about up in Markham did have a natural gas for the domestic hot water. So great point, Tim. Yeah, the carbon reductions of that community are significantly lower than the pure all electric communities that we're implementing right now. Absolutely. So we're getting close. It's no blue flame. So the only carbon call it that exists would be the carbon in the electricity. And Ontario's grid being relatively clean, TBD in the future. But yeah, it does provide the best, call it, way to decarbonize the low-rise portfolio. Yeah.
Do you guys have a metric you've kind of when you're doing, because you guys are very analytical, like kind of a dollar per
Time. Yeah.
what do you guys
Yeah, so no, great segue. So the way we analyze what the best, call it, bang for our buck, in this case, if I'm a CFO, if I'm allocating dollars to sustainability initiatives, how do I determine which, call it, initiative? When I say initiatives, this is things like a net zero ready envelope, a different way of heating and cooling, i.e., air source heat pumps, geothermal, like whatever the sustainability initiative is. We analyze it through a framework where we look at the dollar per ton value to allocate sustainability dollars, right? And we look at the revenues you can generate from said sustainability initiatives. Then we also look at the cost base for said sustainability initiative, and then you combine the two to come up with your dollar per ton number. And time and time again, geothermal has been proven from our experience, at least. I'm not saying this may change for other developers depending on what you charge your customers. It's the lowest dollar per ton solution. It's almost negative in certain situations. So it takes a bit of time to wrap your head around that concept. That means you're getting paid to reduce carbon, right? And that to like if you look at a matrix on the top right-hand corner, those are the initiatives that drive the highest return, the biggest amount of carbon reduction across your entire portfolio.
yeah, and that's a bit, you know, that's a head spinning moment, right? Like that's the real paradigm shift here. I think as an industry, so that 20 years in, it was always a choice between profitability and sustainability. Those two things are always seen as mutually exclusive, right?
Yeah. And our owner said that can't happen. You got to figure out a way to do both of them at the same time. And like when it's coming top down like that, like hell, you're motivated to figure it out because it's such a tough nut to crack, right?
So when you say top down, where did this come? Like, is this like literally top down from Peter
Yeah.
himself,
Yeah.
or
From figure down. Yeah. He's like figure out a way to make both works. And you need, I think, like leaders that you know, say it's not a trade-off and figure out ways to make it work. And if you can't figure it out, prove to me why you can't do it, right? So yeah, we've had those, call it, founding words of inspiration since the beginning of this.
well, yeah, and it's certainly been one of my observations, in the short time that we've been collaborating and working with you guys. I kind of see it as we both came to this with half of that $100 bill, and specifically low rise. We have a lot of expertise within our team, but the challenge with low rise is even if you figure out the ground loop portion, and now that we have our own drill rigs and we can control those costs, there's that integration into the house. Just like with condos or multi-res, you're only as good as geothermal's integration into the mechanical system. And we've had 10 years to work with mechanical engineers and construction managers to refine that process. Single family home, I feel like this is going way back to the origins of multi-res. There is no blueprint, there is no template. We're sort of a little bit of building a plane and learning to fly here to some degree. But one of my observations is with the joint venture now, it's not transactional anymore. So now we're actually able to sit down. This isn't about a single project. This is how do we refine this? So your cost in the home, how do you get that delta from geothermal to a gas furnace and air conditioner down to ideally zero? And I think you guys are already pretty close to that. And you're continuing to move in a direction where you'll probably will be cost neutral. And then on the outside, we're working with you to try to get that monthly geothermal fee down to, I think if you can provide a zero flame, safe, no carbon monoxide detector required home with more living, usable space in the backyard, no noise, a larger deck, and your delta is $10 a month, I would argue, does it even matter anymore, right? Like that's
For sure. Well, and Tim, if the carbon tax exists today, your savings, right? So that says everything, right? And look, like, we all thought carbon tax was going to stay until 2030. It's not the case. And public policy shifts, right? Like Carney tomorrow could, do X, Y, Z, and it has different implications on the industry, right? So, coming up with a solution that's policy agnostic, I think is also very important. And that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned throughout this process was that, you know, not everything is guaranteed. Things come and go. Like ITC credits right now make geothermal even more, make it even more easier to integrate in things like low rise. But it's still, so one of the founding themes that we had from the beginning, Tim, was that this thing needs to work on its own legs. Like you cannot have subsidies prop up this business, right? So if we had those fundamental values from day one, everything else is just pure upside, right? So I think we still need to hold true to that as we increase the adoption of low-res geothermal as time goes on, because it needs to work in a world where subsidies are not involved.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir on that. I cut my teeth in this space, had immediate wins because of oil was high. If you remember back in
Yeah,
2008, it was all about peak oil and the end of oil. Oil prices were high, and there was a $10,000 incentive on the table to retrofit homes. So that was great. The problem is that incentive was a double-edged sword, and it was a sword you kind of lived and died by it. And we leveraged that incentive to do well. The problem is the message we communicated as an industry was geothermal makes sense because. And when the reason
exactly.
that because went away, well, then naturally the reason to do geothermal went away. And
Mhm.
the industry went into a vacuum. And what was interesting is that in Ontario, geothermal sales post incentive were actually lower than they were pre incentive.
Interesting.
So and when we started Diverso, for me, it was we need to change the business model to compete with a conventional utility, not rely on a government incentive to close that gap, right? So
Sure, for sure.
get more efficient, get more creative in the tech, get efficient of the technology and get creative on the business model to make it work without an incentive. And if there's an incentive stacked on top of that, that's fine. And I think you guys have done a great job of kind of incentive proofing your business model where
For
it's
sure.
not dependent on it.
Yeah, and the journey to get that cost neutrality, it's a chicken before the egg situation, right? If you have the pipeline, you have the volume, and you demonstrate to the manufacturers, the suppliers, or whoever that, hey, we have this pipeline and we're committed, bring down the cost base, you know, great. The math starts work. But in order to get that commitment of the pipeline, homeowners and internal, like I'm just gonna say developers as a whole, need to see that cost neutrality and yeah, need to see that cost neutrality up front. So, how do you which one again, it's like a catch 22, right? So yeah, it just can't lie on the backs of incentives for this to work. Like this has to be a fundamental it just has to be fundamental to the industry.
And I think the innovation here for developers, if there's any developers listening in on this, this isn't, it, as much as it's not overly complicated, there's no innovation here in the technology. It's interesting for me, the technologies we're putting in your home, so forced air, water source, geothermal heat pump, a flow center, and one drilled hole with HDBP pipe. These are things that were 20 years old when I got into this 20 years ago. So these are very, very simple, tried, test, and true technologies. I think the innovation is in the process, right? How do you phase it into the constructions? And the difference between low rise and high rise for us, I think, and what you're saying is every dollar matters. If you can save $100, $300, it's kind of like production lines for cars, every nickel counts when you're doing volume. And I think that's where the innovation comes from, but that's also where the you need to have two partners that are highly motivated. And I think the reason this is working with you guys is, it's not easy, but I think what you've proven is that it is doable. Like with the right motivation, the right partner, and the right process, this can be done. Is it as simple as it's not an off-the-shelf product you put into your home like a solar panel. It's very integrated into the construction, and there has to be a level of, in your case, it was almost top down, call it a mandate
Sure.
and motivation. Uh,
Yeah.
and I think without that, it would probably be a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, and Tim, like, we have people dedicated whose full-time job is to figure out how to integrate this technology into our communities, right? To your point, like, it starts from the beginning, right? It starts with how these homes are designed from an architecture perspective, right? So we've done 4 or 5 low-rise communities by now, and we integrated geothermal at all different stages, right? We'd integrate it like when the architectural designs were finalized, mechanicals finalized, like, oh, we'll just put a hole right here in the middle of the house without thinking through the implication of, okay, how's the ducting going to run, right? Like, how are the foundations going to get poured? What's the implication of bringing the hole that's in the middle of the basement to where the heat pump's ultimately located, right? So, and then you move one step back. We're like, okay, like, we're done the architectural side, but we're not done the mechanical. Is now the time to integrate geothermal into the process, right? So, again, through the bumps and bruises, we figured out like this thing needs to be integrated from day one, right? And that requires, like, having done a couple of these projects, and that requires, folks that we have in-house at least, that can work with the multiple disciplines, right? Like the architectures, the procurements, the sales and marketing, to figure out what the best way to integrate this is, right? And from your perspective, Tim, like, it's, you guys aren't a developer, right? So for you to know these implications on day one, I wouldn't expect you to know those, right? Nor any other utility provider, whether it's the Enwaves, the Creatives, or Superas, et cetera. That insight is only, I think, gleaned through having done this on the developer side, not on the utility side.
Yeah, I've certainly learned a lot, and I've tried, over the years, we've had low-rise communities come our way, and we've tried to make the numbers work. And I think looking back, the problem was twofold. One, the developer looked at the inside portion of geothermal the same way you took like a technology that was usually for custom homes or retrofitting. So it's a kind of a unique bespoke geothermal contractor using high-end, residential, very expensive equipment and trying to drop that into a production home environment,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's, Mercedes mentality into economy car production, right? That something it doesn't work. And then we were guilty as well. We're just used to, $2, $3 million geothermal assets going into high rise, and we hadn't quite figured out how do we gain that level of cost efficiency and construction efficiency to bring that cost down of the bore field so that
Yeah.
charge can compete with natural gas and electricity and maintenance and repairs. And I think this has been eye-opening, and I realized, well, it's not that hard, but it took a partnership with Mattamy to drive us and motivate us to put our heads together internally. And I feel like now we've kind of got both sides covered. Your approach in the homes is, whether it's buy direct, it's volume purchasing, efficiency, and every nickel counts inside the home. And we're taking the same approach on the outside, kind
Yeah.
of middle, and lo and behold, it works, right?
Yeah, and the incentives need to be aligned to him, right? Because, like, I was gonna ask him, like, why haven't you guys done this over the past couple of years? But it's like, if you're the utility, you're trying to protect your investment, right? You're like, hey, I don't know what I'm getting into with a production builder. I have underwritten my investment to an X% IRR with, contingencies in place, schedule, assumed schedule, et cetera. And, a production build, to your point, is a completely different beast, right? So through this joint venture, I think when everyone under the same tent, you can kind of be more transparent about, like, hey, look, this is the true production schedule. I know you're trying to protect your investment, we're trying to protect ours, but this is how we come to the best solution that results in, a sum of parts being equal than their individual sums, right? So, again, yeah, and this joint venture, frankly, enables that, right? And allows us to provide this solution at a scale.
Yeah, I think motivation is the key. In the past, just like you were mandated from Peter down to figure this out. Now our joint venture, we've been mandated like, hey, Diverso, low rise is a big part of our business, so we need to figure this out. And lo and behold, put the effort in, and we're able to figure it out. And I think that's the part that was missing in the past. When a client comes saying, hey, I've got a low rise community, what do you think? It's hard to really figure out all the problems when it's somebody asking for a quote, or there may be loose
Sure.
looking at geothermal, they're probably not that serious as opposed to someone saying, we are doing this. We're going to compete with Enbridge. We want to roll this out as much as we can across our portfolio, help us solve it, right? Those are two
Yeah.
very different circumstances. And
Yeah.
so I guess my question for you then is what is, if you can answer this, what is Mattamy's perspective on, other developers? Like, are you willing to, like, is this a secret sauce you're holding close, or is this something that Mattamy sees as beneficial to the industry if more developers adopt this process and you kind of share um, some of your lessons learned, preventing them from requiring 5 years to figure this out like you did, kind of fast tracking that learning curve?
Yeah, I think, the mandate from the top is that, we got to endorse and support the industry-wide adoption of this, right? And, we gotta, as Peter likes to call it, we gotta drag the industry along with this, right? To legitimize this technology and scale it, right? The avenue that we share our lessons learned, I think we're still trying to wrap our heads around what makes the most sense. And Tim, obviously, you've been in the space for the last 10, 15 years, would love your perspective, of how we go about doing that. But no, the perspective is like, yeah, let's share the lessons learned and let's increase the adoption of this.
So what about natural gas? Like when you're dealing with Enbridge, some of these communities, is there money to be saved, or has that been a challenge in the past where gas is already there? And like I'm sure that just saying no to natural gas sounds amazing, but it's probably far more complicated than it sounds.
Yeah, it's frankly, dealt with on a case by case basis, right? Like I can appreciate, like, look, they're running a utility, regulated utility. They have their investments that need to be made. They have their return on equity that they need to strive for too, right? So I totally understand from their perspective. They have their challenges. Yeah, and on our end, I think depending on, the community, the area, the geology, the geography, we take a case by case approach, right? Some instances, yeah, there's been situations where there was an incremental cost from their end to provide the infrastructure, and other times there was no incremental cost, right? So it really depends on the area that we're implementing these communities. So it's not really a one word. It's not really binary. It's dealt with on a case by case basis.
So I think, unless you have any questions for myself, Pawan, I think we've got a handful of questions that would like to get into, and that I'm sure, like always, these questions will spur a further conversation.
Sure. Yeah, let's get into the questions.
Yeah, sure. So, first question is your set up a single system per home, one borrow. So I think we've answered that. It's one hole per home, and Powell, myself, and team have been working on how to even refining that, like the idea of putting the hole right under the house. Because that was one of the first things I saw was, well, why are we putting holes outside the home? Now you have to tie it in through the foundation. We're putting holes underneath 40-story buildings with 6 levels of underground. We should figure out how to put a hole underneath a
Yeah.
single roof.
Like our Tim, like our North Star, I think, as part of this is like, how do we get more efficient? How do we minimize the amount of infrastructure that we put in the ground? And how do we, minimize any integration implications with the call it the rest of the home building processes, right? So removing infrastructure, we get more efficient. We're putting less capital into the ground. The charge is lower to the customers. The home gets built faster, right? So having those kind of things in mind is absolutely critical, again, for increasing the adoption, right? So yeah, those are, I guess, some of the things that we're kind of working on to address those problems.
Yeah, and it's been a shift for us. When you look at everything through millions of dollars, where cost savings needs to be in the tens of thousands, whereas now, oh, it's that's $400 less. Well, $400 in this environment is a lot, especially if there's three or four things that are $400. That's the difference between pass and fail.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and when we started this exercise off, Tim, of comparing, a traditional home versus a geothermal home, you know, call us naive or call us like me not knowing the real estate market or home building whatsoever. You just looked at, okay, where I'm removing a furnace and AC and I'm adding a heat pump. You're like, oh, it's just equipment cost. That's the delta. No, there's like 20 other things that are added, removed, replaced that ultimately lead to that cost delta. And again, that takes time, right? That takes bumps and bruises to go throughout to go on that journey to kind of figure that out, right? Patrick Marion on our low-rise side has been instrumental in this, right? Like he's been the one that, kind of inherited the low-rise portfolio and then, has gone into the point where it is today, right? And, you know, understanding the implications from a procurement standpoint, architectural standpoints, right? Like he's been the one that has is slowly perfecting that integration on low rise on the low rise geothermal for our product types.
Well, and I was just thinking of this. It's a bit of a strange comparison, but you could credit Henry Ford with making cars accessible and affordable for the masses.
Yeah,
Didn't change the technology
yeah,
of the car. He just changed the process of how it was constructed, right? And I think to some
exactly.
degree, that's what you guys, you're not out looking for necessarily new technology, you're refining the process.
Yeah, and if we're solving for decarbonization and how do we do it do it in a profitable manner and for every stakeholder it's a win-win, you have to take the Henry Ford approach that you talked about, right? Um, there's other technologies that you can use to decarbonize a portfolio, right? And you can, add things onto geothermal, de-superheaters, rooftops, solar, but I think our methodology since day one was keep it stupid simple because that's what allows you to scale. Um, you know, we're not saying we're not open to trying other technologies, but I think those need to be experimented in a controlled environment and adopting a very crawl walk run approach to scaling it out across the portfolio.
Well, yeah, and we're a little sensitive to new technologies because we're also having to sit and guarantee this for 40, 50 years, which,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah, the whole, and we haven't even talked about the asset management side of things as well, right? Like there's an underlying 50-year contract that's associated to that. So you want to minimize the amount of moving parts, bespoke technologies, because you have to think through, okay, if this thing breaks down or needs repairs at year 15, year 20, year 25, how do you think through that, right? We're just so gung-ho and focused on the upfront because that's the cool, sexy part of it. But we have to think like, how is the homeowner going to interact with this, and how does that customer journey look like over the next 50 years?
yeah, well, that was the first thing I went to is, okay, how do I work for 50 years? But
Yeah,
so next question, and you can't answer with only it depends.
yeah.
Give a rough range of the monthly rate per home. And I know there's an element of it depends, but maybe a range based on a GFA and location.
I'll say like, look, Oakville versus a Barrie, like 90-day difference, right? We're looking at 20 feet of overburden to 300 feet of overburden, right? That obviously, I think, as everyone knows, running a quick DCF, that has implications on the monthly rate, right? Um,
Or here's a better,
hmm.
maybe a better question is, where do you hope that monthly charge ends up? Like, where do you see this in a
I
year?
hope it ends up in savings, Tim, honestly. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why we partner with you guys is like, look, it's a fully vertically integrated platform. Had you guys not been vertically integrated, and you guys weren't, right? Like calling a spade, like, 5 years ago, you guys were using outsourcing drilling, right? But now the fact that you guys are vertically integrated, you have control over your schedule across the entire value chain. That allows us to bring that cost delta, which, is, let's say, a slight premium to savings, right? Because the day it's savings, this thing's a slam dunk, right? And there's a path to get towards that. And
Well,
working with you
one of
guys.
the things I never even thought of, but with your, zero blue flame communities, there's no longer water heater rental, right? And,
Correct.
that's probably $30 a month right there. So then on
Yep.
top of that, there's gas savings. And I think, you know, to answer that question, to say it's in the range of, somewhere between 0 and $20 a month difference would probably be a fair statement, right? Like
Exactly.
it's close enough that it almost doesn't really matter anymore.
Yep. 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 And that's where like, it's aligning it to like I said, policies or energy pricings. It almost needs to be decoupled from that because prime example is when the implications in Europe for Europe happened, right? Nat gas prices shot up 30-40%, right?
Yeah.
Had you launched the community at that point, your baseline is very different relative to geothermal, right? So we as an industry almost have to decouple ourselves from that and offer this solution almost independently, right? Because I can appreciate where we started comparing it to traditional, but I also want to move away from comparing it to traditional because it's just a fundamentally different solution, right? Yeah, I understand it provides heating and cooling, but it's not an apples to apples comparison from a technology perspective, right?
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing it as maybe, and obviously I'm biased, but
Yeah,
me right out of the gate, it's a huge like it's just the space and noise alone.
that has to carry a dollar value.
Winter
Again,
are sacred.
yeah,
Friday nights, sitting on the deck, enjoying a glass of wine and having an air conditioner blowing hot air on you while making noise while you're having a conversation versus an entire neighborhood that is silent. Like I think it doesn't matter where you come from on climate change, what your political views are, and everything. Anybody will appreciate that, right? And that's one of the things I love about geothermal is we can get past, you know, you look at it just strictly from a practical standpoint, and there's huge benefits associated with it.
yeah, agree.
So a lot of questions here. Some of these are really great. So I want to move
Yeah,
through quickly. What geographical markets are economical to start transitioning from gas to geothermal?
Oakville, Milton, anywhere where you're, let's say, less than, can jump here from a dollar drilling cost perspective. Anything less than 50 feet of overburn, I think you're fine. It's a
Yeah,
great starting, lowest hanging fruit. Yeah,
west of Young Street, south of Dundas, and then
there we go.
Hamilton, Brampton, and
Yeah,
Oak.
yeah, Brampton too. Yeah, Brampton, Oakville, Milton, and Mississauga. Yeah, anywhere you're less than 50 feet of overburn.
Yeah, and I still think you will get the economics are still good in other markets. It's no different than high rise.
Yeah,
We can make geothermal work anywhere. Just some markets, the economics are a little bit better, but that doesn't
challenging. Yeah.
um, it can't be integrated into other communities and still be a
Yeah. I was gonna say, Tim, like that's where like my other comment was, when the question about rates was being asked, we have to take a portfolio approach with this, everyone that's on the call. Certain geographies are giving an absolute home run, right? Like the Oakvilles. But if you wanna scale it, it has to also work in other geographies, right? Like I said, the Barries, the Markhams, etc. And that's where, working with, Diverso from a drilling perspective.
that
Sorry,
tone. I
what
feel
was
like you're
that?
talking to me when you're saying that, but
Yeah, yeah, no, but like it has to work from a portfolio approach, right? Some are going to be, yeah, like I said, absolute cash cows, but others are going to struggle. But the way you optimize, you solve for that is through the portfolio approach, right?
so are you integrating solar to offset the need for grid power? I think you've already alluded to that. The Ontario grid is 90.
Ontario is a bit tough to make solar work. I'll be completely honest, but in our call it Alberta communities, solar is the lowest dollar per ton solution there, right? So right now, geothermal. We're not pursuing geothermal in Alberta, and they're using solar instead because solar is a lower dollar per ton solution. So it's not to say, we're all doing geothermal everywhere. Like that framework that's used to analyze what the lowest dollar per ton solution, that's pretty consistent across our organization.
So, and I think this is next question is one that comes up a lot in high rise as well. And it's again a bit of an older thinking on geothermal where it's about an investment and a payback. So can you provide insights into the life cycle cost and the expected payback period? And I think I'll take a swing
Sure.
at this one. And I think this isn't about payback anymore. Because when you think of, what's the ROI on something, return on investment, if there's no I, if there's no investment, there doesn't need to be an R, right? And the way Mattamy has done this isn't about investing in geothermal for the homeowner and getting a payback. This is about purchasing a Mattamy home for the same price as a natural gas traditional heated and cooled home, where the purchase price is the same and the operating price is essentially the same. So there's no premium, therefore there's no payback. There's no life cycle
Yeah.
costings. We own the bore field with Mattamy, and we're responsible for managing that. That has nothing to do with the homeowner. So you're instead of an outdoor air conditioner in a furnace, which has a life cycle cost and repairs, you're replacing it with a geothermal heat pump, a technology that's been around for 40 years and has a warranty and it's relatively like for like. So I think the whole concept around payback just goes away
Yeah.
completely. And
You can
that,
look at the payback, Tim, if you're the one deploying the capital, like Diverso can have a payback period, right? Because they're the ones deploying the capital and can solve for that. But the homeowner, as Tim alluded to, doesn't necessarily have a payback because they themselves don't own the bore field. So, the example that everyone uses is solar, right? You buy the solar panels, you install them on your roof, you have savings on a monthly basis, and they solve for the payback. It's not like that when, Diverso is the one that's owning and operating the field.
yeah, and the payback on our end, it's a modest return that works, and that's the whole point for Mattamy and Diverso is we have to be reasonable on those economics, so there's just no way to roll this out at scale. Um, has Mattamy made any adjustments to the home architecture construction to enhance the suitability for geothermal? For example, heating and cooling and load balance. So I know you guys have been down the road of OBC, net zero ready, and now you're looking at Energy Star, and maybe in 2 minutes or less, walk through that.
That's that's Patrick's domain. So if you want to reach out to Patrick Marion, he can walk you through that. But I'll summarize it. Yes, we looked at all permutations. We looked at OVC, we looked at Energy Star, we looked at Net Zero Ready. We looked at, how do we construct how do we optimize the layout in the basement to maximize the amount of livable space for the homeowner, right? And how can we tightly package this as neatly and as succinctly as possible in the basement and allow homeowners to, take advantage of more of the livable space. We're still on that journey. We're still working at it. Do we have the perfect solution? No, but it's part of the learning process. And as Tim alluded to, one of the initiatives we're working on is to minimize the infrastructure we put on the ground. That inherently will affect how we lay out the mechanical, call it mechanical equipment in the basement, and make it look nicer, tighter, and provide homeowners with more livable space.
Yeah, and I've used this analogy before. There's a point of diminishing returns, and we see it on high-rise buildings as well.
Yeah.
I use the analogy, once you have an electric car, how much money do you spend to make it more efficient, right? I think you don't necessarily, an EV Hummer might not be the right solution, but going as far as a full carbon fiber chassis and body to try to get more, kilowatts or less kilowatts per kilometer doesn't necessarily make sense either. And it's finding that kind of sweet spot in the middle. And I think just by putting in geothermal and reducing gas, you've already won. Now it's finding that balance of making the economics work.
Yeah, and one of our core values, Tim, at Mattamy is to deliver the best homeowner experience, right? And delivering the best homeowner experience is that when that homeowner walks in the basement and sees how nicely and tightly the mechanical suite is versus our competitors, that's a win for us, right? Again, can appreciate from a utility side that may not matter, but if a homeowner is happy with this new technology that they've inherited on top of the benefits that they're also receiving, that's a win-win, right? And that's something that's super important to us.
So next question, talk about the customer journey over 50 years. How does the contract work? Is it a liability when selling the home? How does billing, operation, maintenance work from a homeowner perspective? So I think, I can quickly summarize this as, without getting into all the nuances, it's not really that much different than your Enbridge or Toronto Hydro bill. There's infrastructure in the ground. You're getting a monthly fee. It's a fixed fee. It's not based on consumption. As the utility provider, we're 100% responsible for that. It's off balance sheet. It's not debt. It's like any other utility. It's a monthly bill. It's relatively straightforward. And then the furnace itself, which is owned by the homeowner, you would have a service contract with a maintenance provider, just like you would with a furnace or air conditioner. Change the filter every 6 months, and the whole idea here is it's meant to look as close to a conventional home as possible. And I think we've done a pretty good job of making this not only technically no more complex, but I would say operationally, it's
Yeah.
what you're used to as a homeowner. You sell the house, no different than Enbridge. That gets transitioned over to no homeowner. They pick up the invoicing, they get the benefit of the service. Nothing really changes. It's as straightforward as any other utility.
Yeah, and Tim, we'll learn things too along the way, right? We're not saying like, but we have everything figured out, and that's part of the process, right? We may figure out ways to do certain things more efficiently for less cost for a lower cost base, right? And that's part of the journey.
Yeah, and that's why I'm referencing more the intent than the ingredient.
Yeah,
I think the intent
definitely.
here is, and I think we're working through this, and from our perspective, from Diverso, you know,
Hmm.
same thing we've done with successfully with high-rise buildings for the last 10 years is make it a seamless transition for the condo corporation or the apartment building owner. This is just
Yeah,
really another utility, right?
definitely.
The complexities on the back end with us, not with the homeowner.
Yeah,
Um, can this model work in the US? What are the challenges?
I can. You
Yeah,
want me to talk a bit about that? Like we've looked at this in the US, and
go
I
ahead.
can
I
tell.
think the answer to what are the challenges, that's probably a pretty obvious one right now for the next few years, but
No, I think well, I don't want to be quoted here, but like I think the geothermal credits might still exist for the IRA, but I could be wrong. Anyways, yeah, so we looked at this from we actually looked at a potential pilot community in the US as part of our so we also build in the US, right? And we chose a community in South Carolina. Good drilling conditions, mostly a townhouse development. And the numbers like it hit our hurdle rate. This was again early on in the journey, so I want to say a year 2 years in. So we hadn't necessarily gone through the construction implication journey that we went on, but we did the feasibility study. The numbers looked great, and this was going to be a potential community that we were going to pursue. So the model absolutely works in the US, but the challenge that we had at that time was that, you know, they wanted us to prove this out in Ontario. They wanted to see results from it, and the CEO was rightfully so to push on that, right? And at a time when the homes were selling really well, you were introducing this new concept that was potentially going to implicate the construction process, may have implications on closings, marketing, blah blah blah, right? So they didn't want to rock the boat too much, but from a purely technical and financial standpoint, it absolutely worked.
so there's a question here. We mentioned all electric homes, no gas, but in your recent network geothermal single family home development, gas pipes were installed for cooking and hot water. So is this, what you're doing now, is that directly because it's one borehole for per home, or is that just more of a strategic decision made by Mattamy that it's not worth bringing in the gas infrastructure for cooktops and barbecues?
Oh, like Tim, the carrying cost doesn't make any sense when we bring in gas. Like just plain and simple, right? And you can appreciate, I'd imagine, again, I'm not speaking on behalf of Enbridge here. If they ran the numbers on their end, they wouldn't see the heating load. You're putting in the same amount of infrastructure, regardless if you're using 1 meter cubed of nat gas or 100,000, right? So if you just eliminated the heating load completely, Enbridge is going to, just from a pure financial standpoint, they're just going to be like, no, we're not putting this in unless there's an increment, unless there's a upfront payment of X dollars to make the numbers work, right? So, and then the other angle is looking at it from a customer perspective, the carrying cost perspective. It doesn't make sense because now you're adding another $25 just the fixed fee plus the consumption of the DHW on that. And you can have non-gas DHW solutions that we've done in our communities that can help solve for that.
For domestic hot water, you're using just a regular electric water tank, pretty
Yeah,
simple.
and we've looked at air source heat pump hot water heaters, and then we've also looked at electric tank, and then depending on the community, we choose which one we want to go with.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that can this model work for existing homes? Geothermal as a technology, 100%. It's, homes have been retrofitted with geothermal forever. The utility model, there's certain economies of scale that are required, so it's not a one-off. This would be, something that we use even multi-res has a certain kind of a minimum hurdle rate and size, and then subdivisions probably, 50 homes and up is probably what's needed to put the infrastructure in place and the business model. Um, I think think that is it. So thank you, everyone. It's 2:01. We're a minute late, but great turnout, great questions. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is for me incredibly exciting. I feel like we're, Mattamy's making history right now. The idea of zero carbon, zero gas communities being rolled out at scale has been talked about forever. And I'll be honest, in the 20 years I've been in this space, this is something I did not think was going to happen in my lifetime, certainly not in my working career. And to see it happening now I have not been this excited about something in this industry for a long time. So, it's been a pleasure doing business with Mattamy and excited about what we can do together. I think we're both leaders in our space and, um, look forward to what the problems that we solve together and how that can be rolled out for, everyone else in the industry, in our industry and Mattamy's. And, let's change the landscape of, production homes, which is exciting.
Awesome.
Yep.
Thanks for having me, Tim. This was a lot of fun.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.